Hey everybody, this is Adam from A to Z's Tiny Woodshop. Thanks for stopping by to check out the video. In this video, I show my process of how I made a custom and bespoke humidor for my older brother's 45th birthday. The sides are made from black walnut that has a little bit of curl in it. The top of the lid is made from a curly spalted ambrosia maple that also has a carved inlay filled in with a black pearl epoxy resin and brass 1/8 inch thick splines, Brusso side rail hinges, and some custom deer antler accents for the feet and the pole at the front. And those have a pretty special meaning as well. I'll get to those later in the video though. So I started off with any project, usually do just jointing one edge for the sides of the box. Once I had one side jointed, I moved over to the thickness planer. I usually make a lot of my boxes with sides that are about 3/4 of an inch thick, or every once in a while 5/8 inch. But because this was going to be a humidor that was going to have a Spanish cedar lining that was about 1/8 inch to 1/4 inch thick, I decided to go on the thinner side here so it wouldn't be too big and bulky. So I had to mill it from about 0.95 inches down to 5/8 of an inch. I tried my best in these videos to capture the chatoyancy of the curl in this black walnut. It's not the most curly black walnut I've ever seen, but I paid $5.50 a board foot for it, and I get it at just a local home improvement hardware store that sells rough sawn lumber. So for that price and where I'm getting, I'm pretty surprised at the nice consistent curl that it usually has in it. There's a better video that kind of shows the quality of the curl at the end of the video. So once I was done thickness planing to 5/8 of an inch, I moved over to the table saw and ripped it down to I think it was 6.5 inches. Once I had it ripped down, I moved over to the miter saw and made a series of cuts just a little bit over the lines that I had marked, probably about maybe a 1/16th or a 32nd over the line, knowing that once I was done with these cuts, I was going to move over to the shooting board and true them up perfectly 45 and even lengths for both opposing sides. Whenever I use the shooting board, I always use my chisel to put a very small chamfer on the back edge of whatever I'm shooting. That just prevents any tear out on the back edge as the plane iron comes across it. So I don't have a lot of really nice tools, but one of the ones that I found value in and I think is worth spending the money on is this Veritas shooting plane. It's hands down one of my favorite specialty planes and tools in the shop, and it's just a simple shooting board and shooting board attachments that I copied from Jay Bates' channel. My next step was to go back to the table saw and cut the grooves on the top and the bottom of the insides of all four sides that would accept both the bottom panel and the lid. And to do this, I set my table saw fence 1/4 of an inch away from the inside edge of the blade. I set the blade at 1/4 of an inch deep. The blade I use is a full 1/8 inch kerf with a flat tooth grind that gives me a nice smooth flat bottom. Once I had all the grooves cut on the inside faces, I bumped the fence over 1/8 of an inch and made another 2, 4, 6, 8 passes. And that gave me a perfect 1/4 inch groove, 1/4 inch in from each edge, and 1/4 inch deep. And I show that here, I think on the last one. So next I moved over to do a little bit of work on the lid. The lid I had carved by a friend of mine, a local woodworker who's an absolute wizard with his Inventables X-Carve CNC machine. Kevin from Centerpoint Custom Woodworking. I'll put a link to his Instagram in the description. Make sure you check him out. Like I said, the guy's incredible with the CNC and he does all my carving work for me. So what I'm doing here is just putting on some Zinsser Bullseye seal coat. It's pretty much just a de-wax shellac, and you can see that this is not the first attempt. In the first attempt to make this lid, I had skipped this step like an absolute rookie, and I should have known better. And you can see how the epoxy had bled into the softer wood fibers there. So that was the second one. Then I moved over to using Art and Glow epoxy resin and a black pearl powder inlay. I measured out the epoxy on the scale there and use a syringe. Um, I like using syringes whenever I do these fine epoxy inlays, just to make sure that I get into all the nooks and crannies and crevices and there's no bubbles. Again, that's not doing it is kind of a rookie move, and that just prevents the epoxy from chipping out one way or the other. A little bit time consuming, but really inexpensive. I think I got maybe 50 of those on Amazon for like $8 or $10. After 2.5, 3 days, when the epoxy had fully cured and hardened, I think it was only 2 or 3 very shallow passes on the thickness planer to clean it all up, and the end result was pretty nice. That de-wax shellac really makes it so that the inlay and borders are really nice and crisp. So once the top was all cleaned off, I moved over to my cross-cut sled on the table saw to bring it down to the final dimensions and ensure that it was perfectly square. I had intentionally cut the entire blank for the top about 1/8 to 3/8 of an inch bigger than I knew I would need on all 4 sides, knowing that I would square it up later on. Once that was done, I moved over and put a 3/8 inch 45-degree chamfer on all 4 edges using my trim router. And if you look closely, you'll also notice that prior to doing this off camera, I didn't want to bore you too much. I also marked out the lines with a marking gauge where I was going to cut the 1/4 inch groove on all 4 edges of the panel, which will be the next step after this. Now that I had the 45-degree chamfers on all of the top corners of the lid, I went back to the table saw and used my auxiliary fence and match fit dovetail clamps. It's basically just a tall fence that I use to cut raised panels and put grooves in large boards like this. I used the same 1/8 inch thick flat bottom kerf and set it a 1/4 inch away. And then once I made the 4 passes, I bumped it over again and made 4 more passes, which in the end gave me a 1/4 inch tongue on the bottom of the board, a 1/4 inch groove above that, a 1/4 inch deep, and then I think it was a little over 3/8 of an inch on top where the chamfer is. And in this next clip, if you haven't figured it out yet, I show how it comes together really nicely and really locks the lid in really well. So in this clip, I show how the tongue and groove on the lid and the side actually lock in together. It really does a really good job of making sure that the lid is nice and secure. The only thing I did off camera after this was shave off very little on the bottom tongue, just to give it a little bit of room for expansion. And then I went back to the table saw and used 1/4 inch Baltic birch plywood, cut that square to match the dimensions for the bottom panel, and then it was time for assembly and glue up. I almost exclusively use Titebond 3 in all my woodwork, and primarily just because I like the extra open work time. You'll notice a little shop hack there. I also use one of those little ketchup and mustard condiment squeeze bottles to apply it. I actually really like that a lot better. It's more precise and you get a better flow out of it. It's just a lot easier to control the amount going out and whether you want a lot or a little, and it's really precise too. So then it was time for assembly, and which is pretty straightforward. Just everything's cut and dimensioned and ready to go. And then I used my Bessie. I don't even know what they're called. They're made by Bessie, but they're the box miter clamps, I think. I have 2 of these, and I use them on every single box that I make that has mitered corners. Usually 1 will do it, but more times than not, I'll use 2 of them just to give that extra clamping pressure. And they're really easy to use, really easy to adjust, and they do a great job of applying a tremendous amount of clamping pressure to the miters. So through the magic of video, the next day I was able to take the clamps off, and everything looked pretty good. So I moved over to the table saw and my spline cutting jig to cut the splines. This is modeled after King's Fine Woodworking. The sled is, as well as the spline cutting jig. And for the splines, I was going to be using 1/8 inch thick brass bar stock, which perfectly matched the 1/8 inch thick kerf on my flat bottom grind table saw blade. So I measured out the splines and accounted for the 1/8 inch thick kerf that would be lost in taking out, cutting off the lid. And I made a total of 3 splines in each corner. I forget the exact dimensions, but I think the top and bottom splines were about 3/4 or 7/8 of an inch from the top and bottom edge, and the middle spline was centered between that. Basically, so that once the lid was cut off, they would all be aesthetically equal in appearance. So now that all the slots were cut for the splines, I used the brass bar stock and my marking knife and just inserted the bar stock into each spline and then scribed them with the marking knife. And basically what that did is gave me exact dimensions of where I needed to cut, and then afterwards I went back and just marked them with a black Sharpie to make the lines a little bit easier. They can be cut any way. A metal cutting blade on a bandsaw. I used a hacksaw, and I have used a Dremel tool before with a cutting wheel. I think as long as you use an 18 tooth per inch or a 24 tooth per inch hacksaw, you can see here it goes pretty quick. And just to be on the safe side, after I cut each one, I make sure that they not only fit in, but that they actually protrude a little bit from each spline slot. And then I used Bob Smith Industries 5-minute epoxy. I've used it in the past, and the reason why I use this specific brand is because I find it holds up well when gluing in metal splines. But the biggest reason is that later on when you sand down the whatever metal you're using, whether it's aluminum bar stock or brass bar stock, that stuff gets really hot. And the Bob Smith Industries quick set epoxy holds up really well with that heat. It doesn't get as gummy as other 5-minute or quick set epoxies. The only downside with this one is I wouldn't even say it's a 5-minute. It is a very quick set, and I actually had to mix up a second batch. I could only get, I think, maybe 6 of these splines in before I had to mix up some more to do the remaining 6. It sets up really quick. So here's just a close-up of the splines after they've all been epoxied in. It does make a bit of a mess, but nothing to worry about because it's all going to be sanded off later, or now actually, on the belt sander. I've done this many different times, many different ways. I mean, probably the most tedious way to do it is using a file. I've hacksawed them off, but using some type of belt sander like this, I find is the fastest and the cleanest and honestly the easiest way to go. This particular belt was an 80 grit, which is what I typically use, which isn't a big deal because it removes the material quickly, and then any sanding marks from the 80 grit are removed in subsequent sandings. For all four sides, I moved over to my Bosch random orbital sander, and I went from 80 up to 320 in progression. I think it was 80, 120, 180, 220, 280, 320. And then just for the top, because it's got much heavier curl, I dry sanded at 400 grit and then wet sanded at 400 grit, and then came back with a final sanding at 600 grit. And in a few clips from now, you'll actually see very briefly that without any type of finish on it, it really does a good job of polishing it and bringing the curl on the top of the lid down to one even level and giving it a really nice chatoyancy. So then it was time to cut off the lid, and using the same sacrificial fence as before and a push block to hold it up nice and snug, I divided the distance between the top two splines and cut the lid off. I think it was inch and a quarter from the top edge of the curly maple top. I make a lot of boxes, and standard practice that I have when I cut off my lids is I always set the blade height about 32nd to a 16th of an inch less than the thickness of the box sides. And you'll see here, once I actually make all four passes, that the lid is not completely disconnected, which I later cut off with a Japanese pull saw. But the most beneficial reason why I do that is because that just basically ensures that the lid, when it comes off, will never be pinched in between the table saw blade and the fence and cause any type of kickback. I've seen people use tape and nothing at all and just cut it off and everything works fine, but that's just a risk I don't prefer to take. And then you see there the tiny lip on the inside of the edges of the sides, which combination of a chisel and a block plane knocks those down really quick, fast, and easy. As I was trimming off the material on the bottom sides of the lid, I couldn't help but be amazed at the amount of figure on the underside of the lid and how it was going to be a shame to cover it up with Spanish cedar, but I suppose it was a necessary evil. Now that everything was trimmed off, just one final check to make sure that the lid fits nicely and snug and the line is minimal. And you can see that polish on top there that I was talking about. And the lid fit good, so I was ready to install the hinges. I use Brusso hinges and hardware exclusively on all my fine woodworking boxes and cabinets, and I think that any woodworker out there that uses them will agree that although they are the most expensive, they're also the best money can buy. Although Brusso does sell routing templates for their hinges, I found that instead of measuring, I actually use the leaves of the hinges themselves to mark where I want them placed with a marking knife, and then I come back with my marking gauge and actually scribe the lines. Not only does that guarantee the exact fit of the hinges and where I want them placed, but it also gives me a nice line to set my chisel in for the final trimming after I've routed them out. I set the router bit depth using the leaf of the hinge to the exact thickness of the hinge, or the leaf rather, and I used I think this was a 1/8 inch spiral upcut router bit in my handheld trim router. And then once I had it routed out on wherever any of the leaves were going, all four of them, I would come back and just clean up the edge nice and straight with a chisel. I typically try to stay about a 16th to a 32nd of an inch away from my scribed line when I'm routing. And I find that as long as I'm careful enough and don't go too close to the line, I can usually chisel it out in one pass as opposed to having to make multiple passes with the chisel. You can see here by going about a 16th to a 32nd of an inch away from the scribed lines and scribing them with the wheel marking gauge, gives me less material to move with the chisel, and the scribed line actually gives me a really nice solid reference line to set the tip of my chisel in, so that I don't need to remove too much material. It's usually just a couple taps of the mallet, or sometimes even just hand pressure, and I'm able to clean up the edges really nice and straight and parallel and smooth. Once I'm confident and happy with the fit, I use a self-centering drill bit. A lot of people call these a VIX bit, VIX. That's just one company that makes them. I think they may have pioneered it, but there's a bunch of different self-centering drill bits out there. Really inexpensive, but they do a great job of ensuring that the hole is going to be drilled in the center of where you want it. Then Brusso hinges come with brass screws and one steel screw. So I use the steel screw and some finishing paste wax to set the threads and the depth to ensure that the more delicate brass screws don't snap when I set them in. Now that I've got that done, I set the box on top, or the lid on top of the box exactly where I want it. And then using the hinges installed and in place, I mark the underside of the lid on the edges of the leaves with my marking knife, as you can see here and here, and that guarantees that's exactly where my scribe lines are going to need to be. And then I go back with the marking knife and a square and square them up to the approximate length. This can also be done using the wheel marking gauge again, but the most important part, like I said before, is establishing a scribed line, not only because it severs the wood fibers, but because it will later give you a really solid reference line for where to set your chisel when cleaning up the edges. Like I said, I've installed many hinges, but I think the biggest benefit to doing it this way, with lining up the box on top of, or lining up the lid on top of the box sides with the hinges already installed, and then scribing the lines on the underside of the lid sides. The biggest benefit to that is that it ensures that as you line up the box perfectly, you're going to mark the lines for these leaves exactly where they need to be. It really just avoids any extra measuring and guarantees that the box sides, front and back, will fit exactly like they do here perfectly without any measuring required. So like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, all the materials for this project were all sourced from rough sawn lumber. I had ordered some 8/4 Spanish cedar from Woodworker Source. It was my first order ever from them. It was a pretty nice experience. Seems like a pretty good company to be doing business with, and I can certainly see myself ordering from them again. So I had gotten I think it was 4.5, 5 foot long by 6.5 inch wide by 8/4 piece of Spanish cedar. But to keep the video a little bit shorter and prevent boring, I had milled that up to just under, probably about 3/8 of an inch thick, 2 strips of that, and glued what was necessary for the top and bottom panels to glue on the underside of the lid and then the bottom of the box. And then just cut to length the 4 sides. One thing that I did, that I point out here, is when you're making a humidor, one of the most important things is to ensure that there's no way you'll ever get it exactly airtight, but you want the seal to be pretty good so that it keeps the relative humidity inside. So the lining on the inside of the bottom or the base of the box, you can see, is actually recessed about 1/4 of an inch. And then these strips that I'm putting in now on the linings of the 4 sides of the top of the box, or the lid, are all proud about 1/4 of an inch. And basically what that does is that makes sure that there's entire coverage of the Spanish cedar, but as the lid is closed, it provides a pretty good, nice, tight seal. I had just cut some strips. I think they were maybe 1/4 of an inch from the same material, and then used CA glue and an accelerator to make a little holder for the Boveda packs, or Boveda, I don't know how you say that. Use some accelerator, put it in place where I wanted it, and then it's kind of self-explanatory. You can see how the 2-way humidity pack fits nicely in there and closes nicely, and it's out of the way. Then I used a force and a bit and marked where I wanted the center of the hole. And again, I don't know how you say it, maybe hydrometer, whatever it is. The little gauge that measures the relative humidity on the inside of the humidor. I'll put a link to where I got those in the description as well. I think they're like $8 or $10. I used this one. It's an analog one, meaning it's not digital. I think they just look a little bit more classic, but I got it on Amazon, relatively inexpensive. So I used a force and a bit to drill the hole for that, and then clean out all the dust with the compressed air. And then again, the Bob Smith Industries quick set epoxy on the edges of the rubber seal around the hydrometer, yeah, that thing. And then set it in place carefully. There was a little bit of squeeze out, but it didn't really have much effect. I was able to clean it off well before it had any time to harden or cause any discoloration to the brass plating or the wood itself. So although I've done quite a bit of narration so far, now comes the accents for the feet and the pull that are made out of whitetail deer antlers. And the video itself is pretty self-explanatory of what I do, so I'll let that speak for itself and just explain why I went with these accents. So my brother and I are both avid whitetail deer hunters, and about 6 or 7 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, after a long hiatus and been brought up as a hunter, my brother got me back into hunting, and I actually harvested my first two bucks. And they weren't champion or record-setting bucks. They were essentially spike-horned and fork-horned, but they were pretty special to me. They were my first harvest, my first bucks, and I wanted to have the skulls mounted as what's called a European skull mount, which is where the antlers and the skull are just essentially boiled and then hung on a wall. But I couldn't really justify the price, but they still was sentimental to me. So after having them in the freezer for a long period of time, I decided just to take the antlers off and keep the antlers. And not having anything to, really do with them or no special idea in mind, when I was crafting this humidor for my brother for his birthday, it kind of came to me. And I decided that what more important way to memorialize my relationship with my brother and how important he is to me with the memorabilia from my first two trophies, and to put them into something that was going to stay with my brother for a lifetime. Sort of a way to say thank you. I appreciate you. You're important to me. I love you. My brother is not just my brother. He's a true best friend, and he's one of those people who, anytime, day or night, I could give him a call and he'd be guaranteed to beat anybody else there. So these were kind of a way to memorialize both my harvests and my relationship with him, and I think they had a really nice touch. So you can see there I had just flattened the bottoms or the bases with the disc sander, and then cut them off. That was a little bit tricky to make sure that both cuts were perfectly parallel, but cut them with the bandsaw, and then use my drill press and a force and a bit to drill a little bit of recess for these black rubber rings that I usually use on the bottom of my cutting boards. They're anti-slip, anti-skid, anti-something. And then once I had those drilled for the recess for those rubber rings, I drilled the screw hole through the center of the antler base, and kind of starting to come together here now. You can see how I was able to position them exactly where I wanted and mark them, and use screws to attach the rubber rings and the antler feet to the base of the box. All right, so I'll be the first to be humble enough to admit it that that was an exploratory attempt at how to cut and attach those feet, and I think it came out really well. And somehow, miraculously, that there's no rock or wobble, and they're all even and square. So really happy that it turned out the way it did. So now I'm applying my go-to finish, especially on curly maple and black walnut whenever I work with it. General finishes armor seal, gloss. Um, Most often I use gloss, but every once in a while I'll use satin or semi-gloss. The oil really brings out the curl and figure in the wood, and it's just got to be everybody's favorite part of any project is applying the finish. But the resin urethane really adds a nice, hard, protective coat to it. It dries fairly quickly. Still a little bit tacky, maybe 6 or 8 hours later, but I can usually apply 3 or 4 coats over 3 or 4 days, and again, it really brings out the grain and figure in the wood, and has a really nice gloss finish afterwards. It's really protective. So obviously this is just the first coat. On the sides, I only did 3 coats. The more coats you do, the glossier the finish is. Um, I wanted a little bit of the green texture to pop through on the sides, not just the figure. So I only did 3 on the sides, but on the top, I ended up doing 7 coats just to give it a more glossy finish. In addition, when working with softer woods like spalted maple, because it's more porous and softer, it absorbs it more. So the first coat goes on heavy, and then you might have a few spots where you need to touch up. Um, but I wanted the top to be a lot glossier, so I gave it 7 coats, which was a lot more apparent in the next couple clips. So as always, if you liked the video, if you found it helpful, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel, and thanks for stopping by.